Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the very first event of a brand new semester here at the American Academy. And we're doing events even before we have officially welcomed the new class of fellows. That's how busy we are. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the Academy. I'm delighted to have you join us tonight for this discussion of transatlantic uncertainty and the future of European defense. And our panel tonight is Mara Carlin, who is this semester's James Mattis Distinguished Visitor, John Feiner, Carnegie Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Columbia University, former Assistant to the President and Principal Deputy National Security Advisor in the administration that ended not too long ago. Zenka Neitzel is the Chair of War Studies at Potsdam University, and Rachel Ellehus is the Director General at the Royal United Services Institute, which, if memory serves, is at least the English-speaking world's oldest think tank.
Yes, oldest security and defense think tank.
Okay.
I wouldn't want to steal anybody's.
Do you know of any others?
I don't.
Okay. And it was founded by the Duke of Wellington, right?
That's correct.
Yeah,
And
not the Duke of Wellington.
Duke Ellington.
What?
Wellington.
And what?
The ninth Duke of Wellington is about to become our chair, so history.
Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, great. Okay. I really like your title. I'm thinking about becoming Director General of the Academy. I just thought I'd mention that. Anyway, this discussion is part of a two-day workshop. I'd have to clear that with my trustees, I think. But this discussion is part of, we're smack in the middle of a workshop that is taking place today and tomorrow on exactly this subject, Germany, Europe, and the future of transatlantic security. This is our second time doing this subject. We did a conference last year on the Zeitenwende. We are no longer using that word with quite the same frequency since the new government here is also not using exactly that word. But it gives you an idea of what the subject of the discussion is. And, since 2022, Germany has been in the midst of a transformation, accelerating at different speeds at different times towards becoming a more capable military power in Europe. The Chancellor, of course, has announced that in just a few years that Germany will have the third best funded military in the world, I believe.
And the biggest army of Europe. Yeah.
And the biggest army in Europe. And that issue has certainly caused some discussion. So what I thought we would do today is try to encapsulate some of the discussion we have. Of course, on every single point, there were many different opinions. So I think that the panelists will just give their views on where things are and where they're going. I just want to say a word about the James Mattis Distinguished Visitorship. It was established as an enduring testament to General Mattis's achievements. Some of you may recall that Jim Mattis received the Henry Kissinger Prize, our highest award and the biggest event of our year, back in 2021, I believe. And just to sort of recapture that moment, both Jens Stoltenberg and Ursula von der Leyen insisted on coming and speaking in honor of General Mattis because they were so enormously grateful for the work that he had done under very difficult circumstances to keep the alliance together. It was quite a moving night. And so it's appropriate that the Mattis Distinguished Visitor is taking on this particular subject. So just to, cut straight to the core of things, I thought I'd start with you, John. And as I said over dinner, I'm going to ask you about the world order to propound on that for a few minutes. You don't have to give us the entire both northern and southern hemispheres, but it has been a completely bewildering period. We have, on any given day, the U.S. was drifting away from Europe. It has essentially changed what, to my mind, was one of the fixed points of American grand strategy, which was a close alliance with India to hedge against China. It's declared trade war against the world. And it has been particularly hard to figure out which way things are going in the Transatlantic Alliance. So why don't you tell us how you see the thing evolving and where we are right now?
Sure. Thank you. Is this working? People can hear me? Great.
And John has terrible jet lag, so be generous.
Thank you. I like to lower expectations. So thank you, Dan. First of all, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Great to be anywhere with Mara, who is a close colleague I guess we're just not going to name the last administration. That was the precedent, I think you said.
We can call it.
The Biden-Harris administration.
It was the third term of Obama,
yes.
right? Yeah. No, the Biden-Harris administration.
People said. Look, I just want to start off by saying it's a bit of a dizzying time to be here as an American and to be talking about events in the world, because we're going through some pretty profound events at home. And I didn't want to let the opportunity slip without marking that we had a pretty appalling incident of apparent, although we don't know all the details yet, political violence in the United States. And I think a lot of concern about the possibility of more to come. And so I think that weighs heavily on all of us. But since you asked me about the world, and that's what we're here to talk about, I guess where I wanted to start, and I will caveat this by saying President Trump does not exactly consult with me about his worldview, but I can observe, and I do talk to some people in the current administration who I've known a long time. I think the biggest difference between a U.S. worldview under this administration and U.S. worldview under basically every other administration that we've had from both parties is that President Trump is quite clear about the fact that he sees the system of organizations, alliances, and agreements that every other American administration has believed served us well in the world as essentially a net burden on the United States. The agreements were badly negotiated. America got a raw deal. The alliances we put much more into than we get out of. And the international organizations are at best kind of feckless and useless, and at worst, counter to our interests. That is basically his worldview. And while, at different points, different American presidents have had elements of that in how they saw the world, there's nobody who has quite seen it that way. And I think a lot flows from that, including a basic way of looking at the other countries in the world in a much more transactional way, and with an eye towards favoring countries that are stronger almost inherently over countries that are weaker. Descriptively believing that might makes right in the world, but also believing that that's kind of how it should be, and that system favors the United States as a strong country. And then the last thing I'll say is that is not immutable. One of the things that's been interesting to me about this Trump term is that he still can surprise you in terms of kind of how he sees different countries. And I'll just give one example from recent times. One of the world leaders who did the best with President Trump in the first term from a big, powerful, strong country is Prime Minister Modi of India. U.S.-India relationship has fallen on incredibly hard times. Pakistan did not do very well with President Trump in the first term. President Trump actually announced by tweet in 2018 that he was suspending all American assistance to Pakistan. He has done a bit of a 180 on the Pakistan relationship. These, by the way, are not unrelated dynamics. And so, while I think we can all come up with a theory, maybe a more coherent theory actually than the administration has about how it is looking at its relationships with other countries, one of the other defining characteristics is that some of this is just very hard to predict.
Yeah. And do you want to just say one more sentence on what we can say about the transatlantic relationship after 9 months?
Yeah. So, look, I think I'll be a bit optimistic if I can. I think this is an enormous opportunity for the part of the world that we are in tonight. And part of why it's great to be in Germany, and I've been back a couple of times since I got out of government, is that challenges also create opportunities. And if the United States is going to play a fundamentally different role in terms of leading in the international system, which we are not committed to doing, at least in terms of providing. We're not a net provider of stability and security anymore, I would argue. We have become, if anything, a source of insecurity and instability. That creates an opportunity for this part of the world, and particularly for Germany, to step up. And I think you are starting to see real signs that these countries will be up to the task, but it's going to be a big, big challenge.
So that's a perfect place to turn to Mara. Mara, you shouldered this incredible responsibility of chairing our conference last year, and now you're back, and an awful lot has happened. And so I would ask you to assess how you think developments are going in that phenomenon that we formerly called the Zeitenwende.
Great. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It is such a treat to be here. I'm so excited to be on a panel with two former brilliant colleagues and a new friend. So last year, my takeaway from our conversations was, gosh, some extraordinary things have happened with Zeitenwende, right? Germany weaning itself off of Russian energy, starting to invest in its military, right? Really big things, kind of speaking, this was the rhetoric that had changed. But the urgency had dissipated substantially, and there were real questions of what was going to happen and what was the way forward. So now a year later, based on the discussions we had today, I'm sort of hit by three topics. The first is the urgency seems back, right? That is, of course, very much tied to the United States and everything that John just highlighted. The second one is the money, right? I recall talking last year and folks wondering, can Germany manage 2% of defense spending? And now we discuss 5%, right? It's a completely different conversation. And then the third piece, which is changing but not changed perhaps, is how does Germany think about its role? And in particular, how does it think about the role of its military going forward, right? This idea of being never alone and of being on a team still seems to resonate. And yet there is a gap in leadership. And who's going to fill that gap? I see a little bit of a paradox in transatlantic relations right now. I was at the Munich Security Conference when our vice president gave this pretty splashy speech. I think some other folks were there as well. And I thought at that moment in time, I am watching a transformation. And I heard from European colleagues, we will never be able to go back, right? This has fundamentally changed how we think about the US role in the world and this kind of, sacrosanct transatlantic relationship. And yet, many months forward, we see a number of examples where on this side of the ocean, folks are still wanting to work pretty deeply and on key issues like Ukraine, and in some ways working really effectively, in fact, with the Trump administration. And so I guess on the positive side, we see a lot of really important progress inside Germany and across Europe in terms of looking at one's role in the world, in looking at how one provides security and stability and in what ways, and in the kind of financial piece and in the urgency to change. I do wonder how sustainable this effort can be to try to keep working with the United States when, as John noted, it's a fundamentally different approach than we've seen for pretty much the last 80 years or so.
At least, yeah. Rachel, So before taking over RUSI, you were a senior official at NATO, and you've kept all those contacts and that interest in that institution alive. And you were speaking, I thought, really interestingly about how NATO, the sort of incarnation of our alliance, is doing. And I would say it was a better report card than we might have feared in January of this year. So you want to recapitulate that one?
Sure, thank you. And it is a pleasure to be here. I said this is a bit of a bucket list item for me to be at the American Academy together with all these thoughtful people. And the discussions today really proved the value of this forum. So yes, at NATO, I guess what I would do is go a little bit back in time before even the Biden-Harris administration and the current Trump administration, all the way back to Obama and even before. There was always this call for Europeans to step up and do more. I think we saw it in 2008 with the invasion of Georgia. We saw it in 2014 with the first invasion of Ukraine, and the message just wasn't getting through. So as disappointed as I am to say it, it took somebody like Trump to show that the US was stepping back from that leadership role to really create a wake-up call. And we saw some good polling today in our session showing the correlation between the lack of the disinterest and the pullback in leadership from the US and the willingness among Germans to step up and invest in NATO, the EU, and other relationships. So the evolution within NATO towards a more capable and balanced relationship already started in 2008. So we saw the commitment to 2% of defense spending at Wales, and we saw a new family of plans that talked about how NATO would fight, and we saw some key capability investments. And I would even argue that we saw a shift in the balance of power within NATO. So there was a time when nothing got done without the United States agreeing to it or without the Quad on board. But particularly after 2022, February 2022, after the second invasion of Ukraine by Russia, you really saw a shift in leadership, and you could get smaller coalitions of countries really moving the needle on things. The Nordics, the Baltics could band together with Germany to really change things, even without the US on board. I would argue that this is healthy, that actually a more capable Europe within NATO and outside of NATO is a more equal partner, and you will find that you have more agency and that you will be a rule maker rather than a rule taker. But I don't want to underestimate the challenge. I mean, I see a very serious effort in Northern Europe and along NATO's eastern flank to spend more on defense and become more capable. I see Southern Europe being a little bit less serious, less convinced about the threat from Russia and what the war on Ukraine means. They have, of course, other concerns about immigration and terrorism, but still the level of investment and urgency isn't there in the same way. So as much as I worry about this transatlantic breach, I also worry a little bit about divisions within Europe. And if I just turn briefly to Germany, it really is impressive progress. I know Germans tend to be hard on themselves, but we need you to project optimism about the future of Europe, because when Germany moves, well, okay, I lost the crowd. I lost the crowd. But seriously, because other people do believe in you. I can tell you that within NATO, when Germany said that they were moving from barely 1.5% of defense spending, GDP on defense spending, to 2%, others followed. When you started to relax export control regulations and get serious about defense, others followed. Because, like it or not, you're at the heart of Europe. In terms of military mobility, nothing is going to move across this continent without you. And so really, I know it's really hard, and I know there's a lot of history there, and emotion, but please, I mean, for the future of Europe, it really is important that Germany maintains the momentum that others here have spoken about.
So that was a better setup for Sönke than I could possibly imagine, because hard on the Germans might be an understatement for what he has been saying lately. He had a very interesting and lengthy and detailed article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine just a few days ago. I haven't heard the new podcast just yet. It just dropped, right? Yes. Okay, I hope I can get away with that. So, Sönke, tell us how you think, in particular, the Merz government, which, to an untrained eye, seems to have done quite a lot in relaxing the Schuldenbremse and the debt ceiling, and in actually starting lots of procurement, is doing. But over to you.
I mean, it's true that a lot of has happened in Germany. This is very clear. I was also in Munich at the MSC, and we saw the speech of Vance and then the Oval Office event on 28th of February, and we thought it could come much worse. There were even rumors that Trump will not nominate a new Zakur. So NATO is still there. There's this alliance. This is positive. The German spending, I also would never imagine the Germans would ever spend more than 2%. So that's all positive. The point, the analytical point is to me, what is the reference point for us? Is the reference point the 24th of February or 22nd of February 2022? And if this is the reference point, we can say, yes, there are a lot of positive things going on. Germans have bought armed drones, 5 Heron drones. Well, the armament is in Israel, but at least we have the drones. So there's really something going on, and pushy discourse has totally changed, etc., etc., etc. But I think this is the wrong reference point. The reference point is, to me at least, and I'm a military historian and I'm very into the Bundeswehr, are the Germans able to fight and able to win? And are they capable? So if the German taxpayer is investing that huge amount of money, what is the combat effectiveness? And this is, from speaking as a historian, NATO was only interested in the Cold War in combat effectiveness. So they evaluate the German divisions. And of course, the problem of NATO is sometimes they just counted the tanks and they could talk a lot about morale. So they have to be polite, etc. And if you, and this is also the tricky thing, because nobody really outside the Bundeswehr can tell, okay, how efficient is that? Because it's secret. Every general, you will see this tomorrow, will say, it's all fine, and we do this, and we've done that, and that, and that. And of course, politicians do that. And it's quite understandable. I mean, if I would be the Minister of Defense, I would possibly do the same. But for me, as an academic with the historical background, I see the problem is that, and this is not only defense, but also a lot of parts of politics in Germany or Europe, we need reforms, right? We have 70 years of peace. And the German armed forces never fought, with very, very few exceptions, in Afghanistan. So there was never the pressure of reforms. So this is a peace army who never fought. This is a publisher house who never published a book. Or something, I mean, or a car company who never produced a car. We know that we have brilliant soldiers, generals, etc. But of course, we have a huge bureaucracy and we are massively inefficient. And what I would expect is that Pistorius, at least, who's a good guy, I like him personally, has a wonderful strategic communication. Say, I'm the former, Bundeswehr was founded on the 12th of November, the birthday of Scharnhorst, the big reformer of the early 19th century. And I am the next big Scharnhorst, and I'm going to reform this institution. And therefore, the voters would say, well, he's able to do that, what other parties were not able to do. But you see nothing of that. You see, if you look inside the institution, which is again difficult from outside, or not nothing, of course, you see steps, but it's smoke screens. So, and then there is a massive frustration within the troops, and therefore I said, when the Bundeswehr has to fight tomorrow, the only thing they can prove is to die gallantly. They have no drones, they have no air defense, no nothing. It's like sending cavalry against machine guns. And the comparison is interesting. So after the Russian-Japanese War of 1904-05, we discussed it also in the American Academy one day here, then the European countries, the West said, oh, the machine gun is something very bad. We should learn from that. And they even changed their doctrines, but they were not able to learn enough and to get it into the troops, the platoon leaders, the company leaders, the battalion leaders, the generals. And therefore everyone thought a big offensive or big massacres. So in Germany, 800,000 soldiers were by the end of 1914 were dead or wounded. From 22,000 soldiers, officers, 18,000 were dead or wounded by Christmas 1914. The surviving officers and men, they learned. And they learned the defense, then the offensive. And this is what exactly, and I always tell this also members of parliament again and again and again, what we are doing at the moment is we are waiting that the first 4,000 coffins come back from Lithuania, and then the survivors will learn. For a democracy, this is not a very appropriate approach, I would say. And we should at least learn and start a process of learning. But therefore, we have to reduce the administration, and I just can't see that. I mean, I know Friedrich Merz, and I know he knows what I'm thinking on that. If he would be on the panel, he would, I think, agree, yes, we will take the measures, but if you don't see what they really do, it's a coalition government, it's really very limited. And then, of course, as a historian, you could say, when do armed forces learn? When they lost, or in the revolution. So, and what we are facing is, by an intellectual imagination, we're going to learn what we've seen in Ukraine. German soldiers have trained 21,000 Ukrainian soldiers. They also, learn from them, drone warfare, and we should implement that into our brigades, etc. but it's really very, very limited. And therefore, I think it really depends on the government, on the Chancellor, on the cabinet, to learn, to bring it forward. And to be honest, I just can't see that. And possibly, this is the rule. I mean, what we all wish is always, you have to end your talk with a positive statement. Yeah. So this is what we do. Yeah, but therefore Europeans will learn, they have to, and therefore we do. But if we look back in history, there are that many examples. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. They faced Napoleon. But at the end, they couldn't agree, and Prussia was defeated 2 times and Austria 3 times. And the Holy Roman Empire was washed away. And I can give you ample of these examples. Nothing is fixed. The European Union is not fixed. So we have to prove. And from an American perspective, we are not America. In Europe, you drive for 50 miles and you're in a different country, different identity, different language, different, no, we can't do this with them. And look, Poland, for example, it's again, I mean, in defense terms, we should cooperate closely with them. But it's difficult from a German perspective. And the big question is, what will the Polish armed forces do if the Russians invade, say, Latvia? Will they send one of their 3 divisions to the Baltic countries? Or will they say, no, we defend Poland? And we have national defense plans. We have bilateral defense plans with the Americans. And we have NATO. And if you ask the commanding generals in Chechnya, will it work? And he said, no. It will not work. Of course, it very much depends on Putin. We know what scenario, and also, I mean, he has also massive problems, military side, etc. But I think we have to be very worried, and we can again and again. And please, I hope for your support. Those who are responsible, we have to face that all the reforms we're not going to do right now. We pay this bill by the blood of our soldiers. And don't forget, you will stand by the graves. And you have to tell the fathers and the mothers why you were not going to do the reforms. Because of the EU guideline, it's this and this and that. So, and I think this kind of, and the reply I always get from politicians, this kind of speech is you're panicking the people. No, but no, I hope I'm realistic. And I got this knowledge from NATO, from my friends in SHAPE, and from my friends in Brussels, and from my friends in the German intelligence service and the armed forces. And they would not speak like myself, but I'm a professor. I've only got above me, so they can't speak like this. So, but we have to get as our job, and I think I feel really the responsibility when I'm visiting barracks and I see the soldier and I see the eye of the soldiers and say, well, I don't have to fight. But I'm an old man, so I would possibly not very helpful at the front line. But what I can do in the political Berlin is to confront the political decision makers with reality. And this is not, I'm not going to say that it's all in vain and it's still in our hands. But if we see as a reference point, are we combat ready, kriegstüchtig, then I'm less optimistic enough. I look back in history. Is there an example? In which a country learned just from the intellectual imagination, perception, reflection? There are some examples, but not very many. So therefore, we have to do our job, and then we have the problem with Germany, for example, the coalition government. And how would you, even if Merz will say, "Yeah, I want to do that," conscription is not possible. It will not happen in this term. So I'm possibly a bit less optimistic than my dear colleagues here. But I mean, Sisyphus has always tried to bring his stone on the top of the mountain. So we again and again have to try it. I mean, there's no way of stopping it.
Okay. Well, yes, on the optimism, skepticism, pessimism scale, I guess we have a wide variety here. I want to follow up, Zanka. Why? Okay, so the reforms are not happening because reforms just don't happen. Okay, unless someone lights a fire under you, they won't happen. We certainly had the impression from the Chancellor who announced that he was going to create the biggest military. Yeah, and I don't think it can be said that the defense minister is not on board with that project. So, what's the hurdle? Why is it so difficult?
Yeah. So some generals always tell me, look, the German politicians, they can administrate, but they can't lead. They never trained leadership. So if I think Friedrich Merz thinks, okay, I want to have the biggest army in Europe, and he possibly thinks once he personally is fine with that, it will happen. But nothing happens, because then you have to get the budget, the organization, etc. This is complicated. This is complicated in a coalition government and a federal state. And I don't see, to achieve that to foster combat strengths, etc., you must change the system. I think to my colleagues, I make this argument. We have in the Bundeswehr more than 50% not on the combat units. So more than 50% is overhead. Your company, if you have more than 50% in administration, you're bankrupt. That's very clear. Or we as a university, if we have more than 50% not in the classrooms, but with the dean and the university administration, we were not an efficient university. So, but I have never heard anything that Pistorius want to change anything.
Mm-hmm.
You have 3,000 posts in the MOD, etc., etc., etc. I can give ample examples. Try to become a reserve officer right now. It's impossible because we have an HR unit of 6,800 posts. Yeah, so it's ridiculous. And then you would normally see, as a reformer, as a new government, say, okay, there are clear figures. This is not rocket science. I cut it down, early pension, whatever. And then we have, a new stream in the institution, and then we have, intelligent young officers, blah, blah, blah. But it's not going to happen, nothing of that. So how would you, with that kind of army, which never fought, which is a huge bureaucracy, how would you achieve that? I give you another example. There is a songbook, a Liederbuch, a German one. So what can a German soldier sing? So there is a new edition 3 years ago as an app on the iPhone. It's ready to launch. So what is this selection of songs you can read while you march? But they have the fear to launch that because there can be some criticism. So there is no singing in German barracks. I only visit barracks when you see, when you don't sing, I don't come. So that's very clear. So how could an armed force be combat ready if they don't dare to launch a songbook? That's ridiculous. So because why is it? It's possibly too militaristic, this kind of thing. So from an American perspective, this is absolutely nuts. And you say, come on, what's the point? The Danish colleagues, the Swedish colleagues. What is? We're still struggling, and it is part of the Social Democrats that. Why do you have armed forces? It's because of deterrence and to fight a war and hopefully to win a war. That's 30 years we had the debate. No, a soldier is not for fighting. It's a peacekeeper. It's a social worker. Yeah, but please persuade 82nd Airborne Division that they are social worker. Yeah, so they would say possibly it's not their approach. Possibly they want to blow something up. But it's still in the GNA. We are civil power, etc., etc., etc. So we have achieved a lot of differences in terms of spending, in terms of technical things. But still, if it comes to, we had a big first Congress of veterans today. So the veteran organization, they're keeping up. So there are things going on. But if the new Zakur asks, okay, what can the Germans deploy on the NATO eastern flank? They have no air defense. But how would you fight without air defense, without drones? How should they will be dead before they reach the front line. And of course, there's investment, but do we have the time for that? And I know of examples that even high-ranking generals want to have new programs of drones, that the armament agency wants that, but then comes a branch and say, no, there are some legal restrictions and there's a problem and here and there. So we are still, the institutional mood is still absolutely peacetime.
Mhm.
And I think from a historian's perspective, this can only be changed by a war. Unfortunately, although I'm still fighting and I'm still talking publicly and internally, because I mean, it's the blood of our young soldiers they're risking on. So therefore, and I don't think that Friedrich Merz has the imagination how to change the system. So his job would be, okay, we want this, and I find a way within the coalition to achieve that. This is Staatskunst, to bring the ideas into praxis. But to be honest, I don't see that. Yeah, and this is a bit worrying to me. So we have excellent soldiers, generals, also excellent ministers in a way if it comes to strategic communication. But how do you implement that? And if you, with Boris Pistorius, he was the Minister of Interior in Lower Saxony, Niedersachsen. If you speak to policemen, say, yeah, it's like the Minister of Defense. We liked him. He was a good speaker, but digitalization of the police, he achieved nothing.
So, Mara, in addition to being a political scientist, you've done a fair amount of history of the American military, I know from reading your book. So what's your reaction to Sönke's remark? I'm thinking of the fact that the US has had to reinvent its military multiple times, after war, after peace. You kind of wonder if there's any simple, bloodless way forward.
Unfortunately, I think I agree with the thrust of what he's saying, which is it's really hard to transform your military absent a shock to the system. And it's got to be a pretty big shock to the system. So the Cold War ends and the US has to rethink the size of its military. The September 11th attacks happen. The US has to rethink like the role and focus for its military. And there are some who actually don't want to get on board. I mean, in that example, we had a Secretary of Defense who said, no, I've got a different plan. I'm focusing on other things. And that didn't go so well, given that the US was then kind of deeply enmeshed in a war in Iraq and a war in Afghanistan. And so I would agree, you need a shock to be able to make that change. What I wonder is what can you do under that ceiling, right? What are the things that, like the progress that can be made? Are there different capabilities that you can try to acquire? Are there different geometries of partnerships that you can try to acquire? Can you use a proxy of just a really good leader to try to play a role here? When we were having our conversation today, someone was using, I think, the really insightful example of President Roosevelt in the United States, who, as World War II is starting, doesn't necessarily want to get involved, but is kind of planting a bunch of seeds in terms of increasing the defense budget by times of 8 in 1940, by working deeply with industry, by supplying the UK, of course, as the US's ally, by doing a bunch of things so that when the moment would happen, or maybe that would stave off the moment, turns out obviously it didn't, but when the moment would happen, he could then make even more of a push. So I guess what I'm saying is I absolutely hear what you're saying. I think I largely agree. And the question that we need to interrogate is, so what do you do under those circumstances? What are the seeds that you can plant and then pluck to grow as flowers?
But you need leadership. And I would totally agree. Roosevelt is a very good example also with his New Deal. So one of the few examples where head of state made really a difference. You could think of a different American president who would have managed that much worse. And there are examples in the German history, 19th century, Defense Minister Rohn, in 1859, they had a reform which led then to German victories later on. So there are a few examples, but you dependent on the person. And a chancellor like Roosevelt, Bismarck, or whatever, Churchill, or this kind of category, because he can make a difference. And if you see the European integration, the cause of the European integration, like, the common currency, Schengen, etc., it was always men like Kohl, Mitterrand, Schmidt-Giscard who made a difference and who had the charisma and the power to put it through in their own administration. And that ability to have an idea, I have the idea, I thought it through, how to do it, yeah, and what's the key point, and then I have good staff to say how I'm going to manage that. I don't see that at the moment in Europe. Well, because the French have the same problem.
Yeah, we'll get to the French in a second. John, there was a lot of discussion today about the the scenarios that Germany and Europe might face in the next few years. And of course, in your last job in the Biden-Harris administration, we can't say that often enough. You had to, confront different scenarios and imagine how the U.S. government would react, on a daily basis. So, what do you think lies in store? We had, former fellow and expert Michael Kimmage was there, and he was expressing some skepticism that the Russians are going to be in any shape or would have any interest in challenging Europe, especially given how bogged down they are in Ukraine. And yet, it is in the air that in 2 or 3 years, Russia is going to somehow provoke the West.
So I want to answer that by starting, I guess, reflecting a little bit on the back and forth that took place between my two colleagues here, because on the one hand, I think it is very good to put the fear of God into the German defense establishment to motivate people. And I am 100% for that. And I think you should go to Taiwan next and try to put the fear of God into them too, so that they are ready for whatever challenges may come their way. But the second thing I want to say, which I think is equally important, and again, I am, people who know me, probably the least Pollyannish, least optimistic person when it comes to policy discussions. But I sat through a lot of conversations when we were preparing for Russia to reinvade is the awful phrase that we continue to use, Ukraine in 2022. Which we foresaw because we had intelligence. That almost never happens. We had strategic warning, and we had a bit of time to prepare. And what we were told is almost nothing that we were going to do would matter. This was a very big, very capable army against a relatively small, relatively incapable army. And that they were going to win anyway, and that they were going to win fast. And there was nothing about the Ukrainian army, other than, I guess, to borrow a bit from your theory, that they had been through some conflict. They had been through some fighting that suggested anything like what we have seen over the last 3 years. Frankly, nothing about the president of Ukraine that would have given us a lot of confidence that he would have grown into the kind of leader that he has been. One thing we don't tend to be very good at, and I say this about myself and on my fellow policymakers, I think I would say this about military commanders who I worked with, maybe it's true for academics too. We don't tend to be very good at predicting what happens when force meets force. When I was a kid, I used to ask my parents, I used to read comic books, who would win in a fight between Superman and, Mighty Mouse or whatever. I sometimes feel like our predictions about how these contingencies will go is about as precise and about as accurate as my parents' assessments. Then, if you look at the assessments that allied countries got about how long the Afghan government was going to hold out when troops withdrew, about how long the Ukrainians would hold out when the Russians invaded, about how quickly Assad would fall when the civil war started, and how confident we were that the civil war was over when he finally did fall more than a decade later. It's just not, it does not tend to be our strength. So while I am alarmed by what you report from hearing from your colleagues, I have heard those kinds of reports before, and there are no foregone conclusions in this business, and I know that you're not saying there are. In terms of what I'm worried about, Dan, and what I think people here are preparing for, need to prepare for, it is less, I think, the nightmare scenario of thousands of Russian tanks rolling across flat ground that we saw versions of in Ukraine. Because I think I have come to believe, at least I believed when I was still in office, and maybe there's some reasons why this is different, the Russians do not want to go to war with NATO. I think Vladimir Putin obviously is not completely deterred in the conflict with Ukraine, but he has been deterred in two ways that I think he has avoided to avoid expanding the war. One, he has not used weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine, and two, he has not attacked, and we'll see what ends up happening with what we learn about the incident in the last 24 hours. He has not directly attacked in an overt way.
You're talking
a
about
NATO
the
country,
drones in Poland.
the drones in Poland. So still some things I think we have to learn about that. And I think he has avoided those things because he does not relish this conflict. But what he does seem to want to do is test what sort of things he can get away with below the threshold of the type of actions that would trigger Article 5 and a possible war. Things like sabotage, things like targeted assassinations, things maybe like these drones, which are, for now at least, somewhat ambiguous in terms of whether this was a mistake or not a mistake. I lived through an incident when I was Deputy National Security Advisor in which I got a call from the director of the CIA telling me that a Russian missile had just killed 2 Polish nationals. And, we thought we might be off to the races for the first direct Russian attack on a NATO country. Turned out not to be the case. It was a Ukrainian air defense munition that had gone off course. So it is these things that kind of move right up to the level of the edge of the kind of thing that needs to trigger a robust response that I think we're not particularly well prepared for, that Russia is pretty adept at perpetrating, and I think is much more likely what Germany and other countries in Europe are going to face.
So just one quick follow-up. I want to get to the audience questions very shortly. If you read the paper religiously, it's actually kind of amazing how many different Russian operations, sabotage, hybrid operations, information operations. They tried to topple a country in former Yugoslavia, Montenegro, some years ago. But they are really, really active, and I don't understand why the European leadership is not talking about it more, especially because in the context of preparing your people for a much more potentially conflictual future, it would seem like it'd be good politics. Is it just too difficult because these people are hard to apprehend? It's embarrassing because government seems feckless?
It's a good question, and I will tell you, this sounds maybe counterintuitive, but sometimes smaller crises are harder to manage than large ones. And what do I mean by that? Obviously, we got a bit of a worst case scenario when it came to Russia invading Ukraine. But in some ways, a harder problem from a policy perspective, because once Russia went in, guns blazing, clearly intent on conquering all of Ukraine, we knew there would be a pretty high degree of unity. I don't think we knew we would pull off the degree of unity and resolve that we've had over the last few years, but we knew that European countries would have to, at least for a while, stand against that. Had Russia done something smaller, maybe just launched a much more significant incursion into the Donbass and said, our goal is only to take the rest of the Donbass, I don't know that you would have seen the same degree of unity and resolve here and elsewhere in Europe. I worry a bit for the same reason about, not the full nightmare scenario that we all think about sometimes with regard to Taiwan, but something smaller that the People's Republic of China could do. Seizing a little island, imposing some sort of blockade, which would be a total affront to international law, stability, peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, but something that would be harder to rally the entire world against than the big invasion, that we all kind of discuss when we're doing our contingency planning. And so, these hybrid operations are done for a reason. They are done because Russia believes they can get away with them because it is harder to rally sort of the full thrust and the full force of the alliance against them. Because they are not the nightmare scenario that we sometimes envision when it comes to Russia. That's not an excuse, by the way, because I think you're absolutely right that there is far too much of this stuff, and they have gotten away with it with far too high a degree of impunity. But the sort of unity and resolve that we were able to muster because of the major invasion of Ukraine is much harder for things that are below that threshold.
Right. Rachel, the name of France was mentioned. And it's hard to think about Europe, shouldering its security and being effective in the face of growing threats. First of all, when you have what has been traditionally the strongest military on the continent in a state of disarray that doesn't show any signs of going away. And additionally, Britain as a power has also been having more than its share of problems due to Brexit primarily, but the British instinct to find savings at the expense of the military is at this point a tried and true one. So I'm curious. You pointed out that the Nordics and the Balts and the Poles have constituted this new sort of center of power in the alliance, but are things going to? Do you see the rest of the traditional powers reviving themselves, or are we in for a long period of shaking out?
Well, it's a difficult question because I think it's too early to tell. There is a lot of momentum, but when I think about where countries are more likely to produce results, it's where there's some sort of overlap with their national interests. So, there was a lot of criticism about Germany, but frankly, the UK is going through a lot of the same problems. The land forces have been cut, in every strategic defense review over the last 2 decades almost. For a while, there was an ambition to be present both in Europe as well as in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific. So, I think each country really needs to ask itself the hard question of what are my core interests? What can I afford and what do I need to prioritize? And where is that overlap between the national and the collective interests the strongest? So, for the UK and their strategic defense review, you just saw a focus on NATO first. And I stood up cheering because for the first time, they were honest with themselves that where the UK could really make a difference in terms of European security was by not saying we're never going to be involved in the Indo-Pacific or the Middle East, because of course surprises happen, but the bulk of the investment and the alignment of the force posture and the capability and choices are going to be based on a NATO first scenario. So I think France probably needs to go through a similar exercise. I think that will be sort of harder because they do have global ambitions. They have territories like the UK and the Indo-Pacific, and they have a big strategic vision in a way that's often bigger than the capabilities of the country itself. But they do have a very strong defense industry. And so there's an area where France, if they think rather than just about national interests, about the collective good, they could really energize European capabilities in areas like deep precision strike. When I was at NATO, it was really amazing to see that although France never took the very drastic step of coming back into the NATO sort of extended deterrence military structure, they were willing to have conversations about the overlap between conventional and nuclear. They were willing to have conversations about how their very independent nuclear deterrent might play a role in the European continent. So I think each nation has to go through and think about where their comparative advantages are and how they can contribute that kind of to the pot of the whole. You mentioned the Nordics and the Baltics. There is something where I think Germany could really learn a lot about resilience and the role of every citizen in society to play a role in stepping up and feeling an obligation to serve. That doesn't have to be in the military; it can be civil service. But there was shock in Sweden when their Minister of Defense stood up and held up a pamphlet that said, "If and when war comes." And they all freaked out and said, "Oh, is war coming? Do you know something we don't?" And he said, "No, but if it does come, you need to be prepared. You need to have water stockpiles. You need to know how to shoot a gun." These things are alarming for pacifist societies, but it's a conversation that we should be having now rather than, as you said, when the blood is spilled.
I think Mara had a question.
Yeah. No, you just triggered something. Rachel's smart insights are offering a reminder of how the transatlantic relationship might be reshaped. So one of the extraordinary things about this transatlantic relationship is that from a U.S. policymaker perspective, we talk to the Europeans about everything. Right? If we are sitting with the Germans, the French, the Brits, we are sitting and talking about Asia, and then we're talking about the Middle East, and we're obviously talking about Europe, et cetera. And I wonder if this relationship doesn't shapeshift a bit going forward, where as the U.S. role is changing and the U.S. is pulling back, it actually becomes much more of a conversation on very discrete topics instead. I think that would be a bit sad, frankly. I know I always learned in those conversations, and we did, I think, a lot of really important work together, but I could see that trajectory changing in a not great way.
Yeah. Okay. Now, time for the audience. Please put up your hand. I think I usually say, wait for the microphone and just make sure there's a question mark at the end of your question. So why don't we start right here? Yes.
Hi, my name is Doris Gray. Mara, you mentioned a shock to the system. And what we haven't addressed at all is I think we already have that shock to the system. What is the fastest growing party in Germany? The extreme right-wing AfD, to which our chancellor is cozying up. Can you imagine this party being in charge of the military? What would happen to the world then? So I think we have a very serious domestic issue on the politics level before we have the problem on the military level. And we haven't talked about that at all. So I just want to throw that out and say, shouldn't we think about the danger coming from the extreme right, growing and growing and growing every day?
I'll offer a thought on that, but I think Dan may end up wanting to offer something as well, Doris, which is, or not. So unfortunately, that's not just a story of Germany, right? It's a story inside the United States. It's a story we're seeing across large swaths of Europe as well. And we do have to remember, as perhaps worrisome as that indeed is, we can't let it profoundly weaken us and prevent us from taking steps that do need to happen. There are vacuums, period, full stop. Those vacuums are going to get bigger. Someone is going to start filling those roles. And in the near term, I would rather it be responsible governments, and maybe through their own agency, they're able to have an impact such that we never get to that alternative scenario.
Actually,
Do you? I thought you might.
yeah, no, you prompted me.
Oh, good. Okay. Good insight.
I agree with Mara. I think, you tell me if I've got this right, that just because there is a wolf at the door, you don't stop doing what you need to do. And I would go a step further and say that the absolute imperative for the German government right now is to deliver on its promises and to deliver in a way that citizens find reassuring. The West is in a complete crisis of confidence in its institutions, from Alaska to to Moldova, and it's a huge problem. And if ever there was a moment when you couldn't just kick cans down the road, this is really it. And I think you're absolutely right to be concerned about the AfD coming into power, and that's why it is so vitally important to get things right and to listen to Sunka. Yeah. Yes. Right here. Yeah.
Thank you, François Guenet, University College London. Thank you for these very enlightening comments. I have a question about one country which is very rarely mentioned and which seems to have a lot of core interests invested in the region we are talking about. That's Turkey. Why is Turkey so underdeveloped as a partner in conversations about European security?
Well, I'm tempted to call on our fellow conference participant, Phil Gordon, who's here, who's spent more time putting up with Turks in negotiations. He's the former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and was also National Security Advisor to Kamala Harris. So do you want to, you don't even want to answer. It's so horrible. The scars are so deep. Well, John, that leaves you.
I can say something.
Go ahead.
John seems like he really doesn't want to answer.
I've got a microphone. I don't know why I have another one.
So the only reason I raised my hand is because to answer this question is because Turkey is a member of NATO and it's a core member of NATO. And I think whether we're talking about mass in terms of land forces, or we're talking about investment in defense industrial capacity, or even about innovation, I think, or regional relations in between Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. I think Turkey has a very pivotal role to play. Again, I mean, you almost need to take a page from Trump's book and try to be a bit transactional and compartmentalize the relationship with Turkey, because there will be things that as a democracy you're uncomfortable with. The crackdown on the media, which we're now seeing in the United States. But, I think if anything, that should teach us not to point the finger, but to find the areas with which we can work with Turkey. I was saying today that, Turkey really saved Ukraine in a quiet way with the production of 155 munitions. They really ramped up production. And drones. And remember that they really helped up with the grain deal, which kept Ukraine alive economically and at a very dark period. So I think, it's very easy to judge and go moralistic on Turkey. And there are certainly things in all of our countries that we have to take care of. But I'm fully convinced that unless Europe finds a way to include Turkey in the definition of Europe and rebuilding European defense, it's not going to go very far.
Okay, so I'm going to go back onto this side. Yes.
You hadn't mentioned the European Union, I think only in a kind of facetious tonality. The European Union had 3 commissioners in charge of security: Commissioner Virkkunen, Commissioner Kubilius, and Commissioner Kallas. You hadn't mentioned them, so they don't seem to matter. You are deploring the lack of leadership in Europe. Well, rightly so, but there are some personalities who could fill that role. I'm thinking of President Stubb. I think he could make a difference, and then obviously Foreign Minister Sikorski in Warsaw. So why aren't they in Brussels, or should they be in Brussels instead of those people who are now running the European Union's security and defense policies? And what would we learn from Finland?
Well, learning from Finland is difficult because Finland has a completely different history, and identity matters. In Europe, that's the Finnish narrative is a heroic narrative. We defeated the Soviets, which they did not do, but it was the narrative. Obviously in Germany the narrative is different, and they have a different geographical position. So therefore there is resilience. But if you are at KDV on a Saturday and you talk about a Russian attack and resilience, people would think you possibly are mad or so. So there is a different situation. And with the European Union, yes, you do have figures, but Sikorski, and he is a very charismatic figure. Last year I met him in Ascona in Switzerland, but he's only part of the game, and you see how problematic domestic relations are in Poland at the moment, and there is massive anti-Germanism from parts at least, and this doesn't make cooperation easier. And even within NATO, you are the expert. What I got from my friends is that the Poles were interested in the Americans. They trusted the Americans, not necessarily NATO. They have their command ship there, so that's really problematic. And what we would need, I think, is a leadership, and possibly we see that now, like in the old days when Europe really went forward. We had from the bigger states, France, Germany, Britain, Italy, a cooperation of leadership, and they brought things forward. Now are things more complicated. And at least I'm happy with Friedrich Merz on very much so in terms of foreign policy. The role he plays, he is in a way of foreign policy, a charismatic leader. He can speak a good English. He's used to the United States, etc. Compare his role with Olaf Scholz, who stand there quiet, does not talk, was overlooked, where, when the boys of the prime minister say, yeah, we're going to manage that, where was Olaf Scholz was hiding behind the curtain. So that's really atmosphere of matters. So therefore, I think, but with Friedrich Merz is really the leader of the foreign leader of the category of Kohl or Mitterrand. I don't know, because also the European Union became more complicated. We are not in the 80s anymore. And when I travel to Brussels and speak with German ambassadors to the European Union, they are very frustrated. They are very frustrated. And what we see in the public discourse, unity, and we do, it's everyone against the other, and the Germans can pay the bill. So it's really difficult, and possibly I'm not going to say that we are going to lose and there will be no Europe anymore. But possibly we face unprepared, more or less, a war, and then I think democracies can be strong. They can be strong in that very moment. The fact I'm struggling with is we possibly see this danger, although we don't know the scenario, but we have to be prepared. And I don't want to stand, before 4,000 coffins and say, if we would have done reforms, these people were still alive. But if Europe had to face a major Russian or a medium Russian attack, I'm absolutely convinced that our soldiers are going to fight. And they will die for whatever, the country, Europe, whatever. And possibly I also totally agree, we should not expect to dig in at the Zelo Heights and fight against 3 Guard tank armies. We were also not having in Berlin an air war like in the Second World War. But, and as you know, shape things about the question, okay, the Russians have 1.2 million soldiers. What do you do with 1.2 million soldiers? And this is a threat in itself. And although there are limits, and therefore is the NATO defense plans, and therefore they ask the Germans, okay, raise your armies because we never know. If this is the most likely scenario, of course we don't know. Possibly we are all wrong, like in the Cold War, where NATO was in total fear about Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and now we know that, at least on the political side, it was, I think, never the intention to let the Cossacks go and to have the big war, as far as I'm aware. The military planned for that, but not on the political leadership. So possibly one day we will think, we will see fights and see Putin has never the intention to attack NATO, but we don't know.
Can I say something briefly?
Yes, please.
I feel like I'm unintentionally casting myself in the role of defending first Germany, now European institutions against a European as an American, but I actually do think it's
we
important,
love it when that happens at the Academy.
for an American to do that, even if against type. So I guess I'd say a couple things. One, the EU deserves more credit than it gets, actually, for the role that it's played since the emerging crisis in Ukraine and began in 2022. Deserves more credit than it gets, by the way, in the United States, too. And we tried, because frankly, it's an issue in our politics, the perception that Europe has not done enough. When in reality, Europe has put more money into Ukraine than the United States has. European sanctions against Russia both cost European countries more and hurt Russia more than any American sanctions did. And the EU also did a quite important thing to signal to the people of Ukraine about the future by starting down the process formally of membership, which, we tied ourselves in knots in the NATO context about how exactly to do. So all of those, I think, were major, significant, important contributions to the question, to not just prosperity, but to security in Europe. And I think the big open question now, and I think the person who should be really speaking to this is a representative of France, which has for quite some time put forward this idea, I think largely anticipating the Trump era in some ways, of the United States not necessarily being a permanently reliable partner and needing a degree of European sovereignty in the security context. Well, now that moment has come, and we'll see. But I do think it is unfair, not that you were doing it, but the question suggested, I think, that we were doing it, and I want to just be on the record that the United States is for a strong Europe, and we got a strong Europe when we needed one after 2022, and that was important.
I don't think the United States today is.
Sorry,
it's an ambivalent.
Until January of 2025. Is strong Europe.
Michael Kimmage, distinguished former fellow here at the American Academy.
So it seems to me that there are two key questions to European security at the moment, and one you've covered in great detail, which is stopping Russia or containing Russia, kind of call it what you will. The other is integrating Ukraine into Europe, and John, you just touched on it. And on the one hand, I think Ukraine will never get security guarantees from Europe or from the US because nobody wants to put troops into Ukraine. So that discussion seems to me a bit of a, I don't know, red herring or a bit of a distraction. But the core question of Ukraine's integration into Europe is very vital, and it seems to me like you can argue that it's half full, that the door is being opened, but you can also argue that it's half empty because the experience of Ukraine now is categorically different from the experience of anybody in non-Ukraine Europe. The bombs are dropping on the heads of Ukrainian civilians and not on anybody else in Europe. So I'm curious for your assessment of that. Is that going well? Is Ukraine being integrated? Is it not being integrated? Is there something that needs to be done? Is there a missed opportunity at the moment? But it seems to me as important, if not more important, than stopping Russia.
Yeah. Okay. Well, looks like it's me again. Brussels. Yeah. And London. I mean, again, this is an area where, well, let me go back again to my time at NATO, because I think people here will remember that we did, even under the Biden administration, argue that the Europeans should be taking on a leading role, more leading role, and that the U.S. should step back. But funny enough, the Department of Defense was not a big fan of that idea and really wanted the U.S. to be in a leadership role. Well, fast forward now, I think some of the things we put in place in NATO, like making sure that elements of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group were led by European partners in terms of the capability coalitions, making sure that it wasn't just SACEUR, an American, leading some of the planning, that there was a European by his side. I think all of those laid the groundwork for what you're talking about, which is a path for Ukraine to more integration with Europe, absent either NATO or EU membership. And we haven't talked about it yet today because I think we have a very defense and security focused crowd here. But increasingly the definition of security is not just military. And while I don't discount the value of security guarantees and membership in NATO and membership in the EU and sort of the security guarantees that would bring, I think the economic integration and the economic security and the societal integration is almost as important. And that is where I think we can really make a difference, agnostic of that membership. So a couple of moves that we've seen recently, I think, so Denmark, for example, has said that not only will they invest in Ukrainian defense industry, but they will welcome Ukrainian engineers and industry to operate on their soil and partner with their companies. And I think, Sönke, you said today that Germany would have a lot of barriers to that, but those are exactly the types of barriers that we could tear down in order to make sure that there is economic integration between Ukraine and Europe. There's a lot of work being done on procurement reform, anti-corruption, all of these things. These are things that will make Ukraine more resilient, regardless of whether it ever becomes a member of those organizations. So if we're waiting for the security guarantees, I agree with you, we'll be waiting a long time. But that integration, by virtue of the fact that Ukrainians have bled for us, they've attrited Russian capabilities along, that multi-kilometer border with Finland. They've attrited Russian nuclear capabilities. That is worth something.
Okay, I think we had a here and then there. So, okay. Well, we'll do it in reverse then. That's okay.
All right.
Go ahead.
My name's Rudy Bresser, and thanks for your thoughtful comments. I'd like to move the discussion towards an aspect that we haven't touched upon tonight, and that is nuclear deterrence. Even if we had effective, well-trained, combat-ready European armies, I don't think it would stop an aggressive tyrant like Putin. But what would stop him if the Europeans had a credible nuclear deterrence? And how this could be accomplished is one question. Of course, we have two countries, but their nuclear deterrence is next to nothing as compared to what would be needed.
Well, that issue has come up, and we know that there's going to be more to talk about. I don't want to get into a fight between the two of you.
We should both answer. You want to go first? Or you want? Okay, I'll be quick. One is I think the Europeans do have a credible nuclear deterrent because the United States remains a credible nuclear deterrent. I don't want to assume otherwise. I recognize there may be some debate about that, but it's strongly my view that remains the case. But leaving that aside, the role that nuclear weapons have played in the Ukraine conflict is, I think, something that's going to be studied and debated and disagreed about. Because you can make the argument that the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons has deterred the West from direct involvement in the conflict. And I think probably on some level that's true. The United States, speak for us, we've intervened in other contexts in which a country has waged a war of aggression against another country when the aggressor did not have nuclear weapons. In this case, we chose not to directly intervene. But you can also make the argument that the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons has not in any way deterred the United States and the West from imposing a just unfathomable 3 years ago cost on Russia. More than 1 million casualties, dead and wounded during the course of this conflict. And the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons did not stop that. And having been part of the team that had to kind of constantly calibrate and manage, are we taking it too seriously? Are we taking it not seriously enough? We get criticized from both sides. President Trump said we kept putting the country at risk of World War III during the course of his presidential campaign. Many of our colleagues in Washington believe we were, excessively concerned about a nuclear escalation. I guess if I had to err on one of those sides, I would err on the second, candidly. But we managed to inflict that cost. The Ukrainians managed to inflict that cost on the Russians without crossing the two lines that we were most concerned about. Again, the use of weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine by Russia and an attack by Russia on NATO. So my argument when I'm asked this question is that actually Russia's nuclear capability did not prevent us from deterring them and imposing a significant cost on them at the same time. I realize you can argue that question from the other perspective, but I feel like that is a pretty strong case to rebut. I don't know.
I agree with a lot of what John said, and would add just a couple points. We were the closest to nuclear use in the last few years than we have been in a couple decades. That's pretty astonishing when you think about it. And as John says, I think that deserves a lot to be studied. It has been really striking to me since leaving government, and I think John and Rachel might have had this experience as well, how many folks haven't quite internalized that. And I just find that sort of like discomfiting and astonishing. It is good that Putin got the message. I would also like others to have realized as well.
Have we been close?
Sorry?
Have we been close?
Yes. Period. I would absolutely say that. Yes. We have been the closest in the last few years than we have in at least 5 decades. So that's sort of point one, and it took, I think, serious, thoughtful, multilateral approaches and bilateral approaches to bring that threat down. Where I might slightly debate with John is, yes, extended deterrence still exists. Yes, there is a meaningful U.S. nuclear capability, and there's sort of kind of a European one. But there's capability and there's will. And the idea of extended deterrence, since its birth, has always been a little bit of a bet, right? And I've just been really struck by conversations across Europe and across the Indo-Pacific in the last few months, where folks are starting to think about nuclear weapons and the potential for getting even a latent capability in a way that they were not 5 years ago. I have wondered a lot if, when we are sitting here a few years from now, if we can get Dan to invite us all back to this beautiful place. I've wondered a lot if we have more nuclear powers in the world. And that's not something I thought about for a very long time.
You may not have to wait all that long. I'd love to see some programming on that soon. And, we know the Koreans are talking about it. We know the Japanese are talking about it. It is actually interesting how little we hear about other Europeans talking about it. But I would venture a guess that is going to happen. And that was going, especially for countries that put as much stock in the multilateral system and things like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that is going to be a deeply problematic conversation. Okay.
I would just add on that front, I mean, there was a pretty spectacular event this summer as well, if you all remember, with the U.S. strikes on Iran. Yeah. And it's quite conceivable that one of Iran's lessons learned from that experience in the 12-day war is that actually getting a nuclear weapons capability might make more sense than it did before. Yeah.
I do think actually the Poles were talking about it. So anyway, yes, right here. You've been very patient.
That's a quick one. To our historian, did you consider technologies, like I think the drones were mentioned, but also what do you think about artificial intelligence? I think that those are two brand new technologies which may play an important role and may lead to the fact that the armies no longer need to be the biggest army, but the smartest army.
Well, this is the big debate about the revolution of military affairs, which we discuss even about early modern history, the introduction of gunpowder, of artillery, of machine guns, of aircraft, etc. And of course, we always have think tankers saying everything will be new. We need only drone brigades. Then come we historians say, it's more complicated, and we always be annoying to the political scientists. I think it's always a compromise. And what you see is not that way. I mean, we can endlessly talk about the definition of the word revolution, but it's more an evolution. So we see the old and the new, and it's a mixture of both. So we see drones, yes, it's very important, and it's totally changed warfare. And within the staff headquarters, there's a debate, will there be still a war for maneuver? So the whole idea of NATO, etc., was about armor and quick movement, what they learned from the Germans in the First and the Second World War. But is a tank warfare still possible? Well, we don't see that right now in Ukraine. But a war of NATO and Russia will be very different, I think. And I think the thing, how are we going to fight in a drone environment, will be solved somehow. And this is the biggest question right now. Is it possible to have an operational breakthrough a heavily defended front line? Now, at the moment, the Russians are not going to do this. The Ukrainians were not able to do this. And if a German brigade would have attacked in summer 23, they would have also failed. But are we going to solve that problem? Question mark. And it's always old and new in a specific mixture. So I was asked before the war, okay, the next war will only be cyber and drones. It was very unlikely. And what you see is artillery. Sometimes Ukraine is more like the First World War, and you need to see stormtroopers, etc. So the big question will be, and then it's also the argument, the smartest army, but you need boots on the ground. The Ukrainian armed forces have lost 3 times the whole German army. 3 times the whole German army dead or wounded. So, and then how could anyone be against conscription or a part of conscription? So when I talked about, German parachute regiments, they know we need professionals. I said, yes, but you would be dead within 3 months. And then only I am there to fight, but I'm not a professional, I'm a historian. So these kind of learning, and this is an intellectual capability, which we have to, what are we, is the Bundeswehr, NATO, etc., are learning institutions. And how do we learn, and not only intellectually, but implement that into the troop levels? That's the big question. And then we see, or I see in Europe, different speeds of learning. And I think the smaller countries are quicker. So if you go to Estonia, there is an IT culture. If you go to Sweden, I'm not saying that we Germans are not learning, but then I end up with my bureaucracy. So, but we are not the quickest. But the Nordic countries are much faster in this kind of learning process. I mean, that's decisive. And what we all do not know, how will the next war look like? It's impossible to say. But we at least can do some steps to say we have a broad toolbox to prevail in the next war. But it will not only be one side. It's a mixture of old and new.
They must really love it when you come to visit at the MOD.
Yeah. They really love me, especially on the MOD, on the leadership level.
Yeah, you've been very patient, and it's your turn to ask a question. Yeah.
2 very brief questions, because I used to work with NATO 25 years ago and was involved with the NATO-Russia Council. At that time, we had a very peaceful time in terms of relations to Russia. It was a post-Kosovo conflict time. We had Vladimir Putin cooperating with George W. Bush after 9/11, fighting against terrorism. Are these times gone? I mean, is this now, even in change of leadership in Russia, would that be a chance if, like in 1985, after Andropov and Brezhnev and Chanenko, we had Gorbachev, but these times are gone, right, in your point of view? Because I was just wondering, because when I was working at the NATO-Russia Council, it was very productive and very in a constructive way. And a second very short question, is there, in your point of view, a very major difference between President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance in terms of Ukraine and Russia? And if, God forbid, President Trump will, if J.D. Vance would become the next president, would his approach to vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine different than it's currently within the policy?
I think everyone's jumping up and down to answer those.
I guess I'll just say yes to your first question. Kind of unforeseeable that we're going to go back to the days of kind of close or even any collaboration, cooperation. You know, anything's possible. Countries change their entire identity over the course of a generation, but we're probably a generation away at least from something like that, and no sign of a leadership change in spite of everything that's happened in Ukraine. So. We are really the wrong people to ask about the sort of inner monologue of J.D. Vance or Donald Trump. I guess the one thing that I would say about this is there's no reason to believe, I think, that Vice President Vance would take a fundamentally different approach to the conflict from what President Trump has taken. And if anything, I think at least the reporting that's become public about their internal debates suggests that Vance is one of the people pushing Trump much more in the direction of a conciliatory approach towards Russia, and not like some others may be pushing Secretary of State / National Security Advisor / Archivist / USAID Administrator Marco Rubio, but that he's losing that debate essentially to the Vice President. And you know, I think the President's instincts on this have been very clear for quite some time. He would like a better relationship with Russia. He would almost like a better relationship with Russia as the strategic goal, and ending the war with Ukraine is a step that must be taken to get to a better relationship with Russia. I can't speak as to why that is the case, but that actually seems to be the way he thinks about it. I can't see any reason to believe that Vice President Vance has a fundamentally different view, but I can't be sure.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that. The only thing that I'm wondering as well is President Trump has shown a willingness to try to engage with Europe, and been his views and approach have shifted to some extent on some occasions based on those engagements. And I haven't quite seen that level of interest or engagement from Vice President Vance. And in fact, when he has engaged Europe, it has seemed to be quite catastrophic, in fact. So I wonder if there's not something there. I think on the Russia piece, they're probably in a much more similar place, but that may be, you know, at an operational level, less strategic level, perhaps meaningful.
Yeah, and if you remember the famous Signal chat when he said, "Oh God, I hate the Europeans. I don't want to bail them out again." So, you know, I would not look for.
Well, and you sort of went through the two of, I think, three pillars of a kind of Sputnik moment that the European countries experienced. Obviously, the dressing down of Zelensky in the Oval Office and Vance's speech in Munich. But I think the third leg of that stool is the intervention by Vance and Musk in Germany's election on behalf of the AfD. So, you know, not an encouraging story.
Okay, we could go on for quite a long time. We probably shouldn't. I just wanted to say, first of all, that you know, we're extremely grateful to General Dynamics, RTX, and Eric and Wendy Schmidt for their contribution in support of the Mattis Distinguished Visitorship. And I want to thank the sponsors of this conference, in which we are in the middle, Airbus, Roda and Schwarz International GmbH, and Stark Defense. And they made all of this possible. I really want to thank our panelists for having a variety of different views beautifully expressed, and for sparking a really great